This is Visitations Conversations. The purpose of this program is to provide inspiration to people aspiring to go deeper into the world of comic books and entertainment. Please check out the channel for interviews that range from comic creators, podcasters, cosplayers, and filmmakers. My name is Scott Larson. I am the creator of the comic book series, the independent comic book series, Visitations. Visitations is the history of Chicago as seen through the eyes of the residents of the city's oldest cemetery. It's part history, part adventure, and part horror story all rolled into one. It's kind of like Indiana Jones meets the Untouchables in a graveyard. And if you're interested in reading a copy of the first issue for free, please feel free to email me at visitationscomicbook@gmail.com or click the link below. Today, I'm really excited because the person who I'm going to be talking to is somebody whose work I've looked at for quite a while. He is the former editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics. He's written a lot of different things, including the Fantastic Four, Amazing Spider-Man, Archie, Superboy, and just about anything that is out there. And so I want to tell you real quick, I've got a couple real quick stories about when I've encountered him in the past. His name is Tom Defalco. And way back when I was 17 years old, I had met him at a comic book convention here in Chicago. And he wasn't editor-in-chief of Marvel yet, but he was about to become, he was about to fill that role. And he looked at my artwork, and it was the typical artwork of a 17-year-old. But he said some really, really, really nice things about it. And he also gave me some advice on inking that I always think about even now when I'm working on my own stuff. And it had to do with line weights and trying to make some things look as if they're closer as opposed to further back. And then the other story I want to tell you is when I met him in 2008 in at a New York comic convention. And he was really nice. I talked to him for a couple minutes and I showed him some of the stuff I was working on. But the thing that really impressed me the most about him was he was sitting there and somebody had come up, and it was a comic book dealer, and he had a stack of comics that was probably about that high. And he just stuck them right in front of Tom Defalco, and Tom just signed all of them. Didn't ask what they were for, didn't ask if they were going to be sold, which I'm sure they were going to be sold like right away. And he did it without questioning, and he did it happily. And it was a really interesting moment for somebody standing on the sidelines to see the stuff that these guys are asked to do and how they're willing to do it without any squawking or complaining or anything like that. So I'm going to ask Tom to turn his camera on, and I am going to also ask him to unmute himself. There he is. Oh, there you are.
Yeah, did I unmute myself?
Yes, you're there. You're live.
Hey, I can do things. How's it going, Scott?
Good. How are you?
I'm pretty good. I listened to those two stories you mentioned. I'm glad I was nice to you when you were 17. The idea in 2008, yes, we signed all sorts of comic books for free. Mm-hmm. These days, because of eBay and that sort of stuff, we now charge for our signatures and stuff like that.
Well, I had seen Howard Mackey in Baltimore a couple of years ago, and I'd asked him to sign something for me, and he charged me like $5 or something. And I told him the story that I just told, and I said to him, "I'm really glad you're charging." Because it's important for people to just go off and sell them and make money off of what you're doing when you're not, getting compensated for it. It's kind of wrong,
Well, I don't know what's right or what's wrong anymore with that sort of stuff. I often think back when Spider-Man with the black costume came out, the Amazing Spider-Man. Mm-hmm. 252. I might have the number wrong.
No, you have it right.
Okay. Because the comic book sold out so quickly, Marvel didn't have any comp copies for us. Mm-hmm. So Ron Friends and I were at a comic book convention, and a dealer came by with a big pile of the comic books and wanted us to sign them all for free. And Ron said, "Okay, we'll sign them, but you got to give us a copy each." And the dealer balked. He,
Oh, no
he,
kidding.
he said, no, that'll cut down on my profit. and Ron said to him, "Well, how much profit will you have if we don't sign them?" And the guy thought for a few minutes. He says, "Okay, I'll give you a copy each," which was, a big concession on his part.
Mhm.
Then Ron and I got into trouble with those same comic books because later on we had to run to a panel. And as we ran to the panel and, walking up on stage, we rolled up the comic books. We each rolled up the comic books and shoved them into our back pockets. When the fans found out that those were 252s that we had shoved it up there, I thought they were going to yell at us. Well, they did yell at us, but I thought they were going to get violent.
Was that the same convention?
Yeah, it was all the same convention.
Okay.
I mean, we, to us, 252 was just, when it came out, we rolled up our copies because we intended to go through it and try to figure out what we had done wrong and how to improve our craft. When the comics came out, Ron and I used to go through them panel by panel and figuring out, we shouldn't have, this was a wasted balloon. Maybe we should have done this instead of that. Because we wanted to learn how to do it better.
Mm-hmm. Well, I had spoken to Dan DiDio about a week or so ago. He was at the Wizard World convention here in Chicago that I was at. And he was looking through some of the stuff I was working on, and it's one of those things where someone's looking at this stuff that you did even 2 or 3 years ago, and you're just like, oh my god, that's so terrible. I don't even want you to see it. What do you think? And I made some kind of a comment about not being super thrilled with the work that I had done, because the next one is always better, and then the next one is always better. And he looked at me kind of funny, and I didn't follow up on it. But the truth is if you're a creative person and you think you've made it and you don't have to do anymore, you're dead. It's over.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Somebody told me once, and I think it was John Buscema. It could have been Sal, it could have been anybody, but said to me, basically in this business, you're either getting better or you're getting worse, but you're never staying static.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to keep getting better. And John was a man who in his 70s was taking art classes.
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of people were shocked to hear that John Buscema was still taking art classes, but he was. And I always admired that of John.
So going off that real quickly, I've listened to a lot of different interviews that you've given. And so I'm telling you that now because at some point I'm probably going to know these stories before you tell them. And when I talked to Danny Fingeroth, he thought I was stalking him. So I'm not stalking you, but I have listened to a lot of interviews that you've given. And in one of them, and this was a couple of years ago, you had mentioned that you were still taking writing classes.
I haven't in a couple of yeit's
Okay.
But yes, I do still take writing classes because it's good to keep questioning the craft.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about the craft. I often think that I'm 2 or 3 years away from really controlling the comic book thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm I just need about three or 4 more novels, and then I'll get that right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Teleplays and screenplays. I think I've retired from that field, so I'm good. I'm good. I never quite got as good as I wanted it to be, but I don't think you ever do get as good as you want it.
Right.
One of the things I've often told Ron friends is don't look at the published book, the published work, because all it can do is depress you.
Mm-hmm.
You'll either see all the mistakes you made, or you'll look and say, "Man, I was better a couple of months ago. What happened to me?"
Mhm.
So
So I have like a ton of different questions about all this stuff that you just said, but I want to make sure that we talk real quickly, or however long you want, about the crowdfunder you're doing. I was really happy to see that you guys were doing that, and I'm curious on a couple of different levels. I want to know what it's about, and I'm curious as to how it came about.
it came about in a very crazy way. All right, the crowdfunders. All right, the comic book is called Tom Defalco and Ron Friends, The R.I.G.H.T Project. And many years ago, Ron and I, I done a book for Image called Randy O'Donnell is the Man with Ron Lim. And Ron Friends and I decided to work on another comic book. And we started putting together those ideas, and we came up with what we thought was a really cool thing called the Right, Mr. Right, and a number of different things happened. Some TV people got interested right away. A whole bunch of confusing things happened, and bottom line is we ended up not publishing it with Image. We were going to hold off for a while, and then Ron and I kept looking at it, and we kept saying, well, you know what, we're going to work on this in our spare time. 20 years goes by, and Ron and I realized we're running out of time. Forget about spare time. And recently a company came approached us and said, we're interested in augmented reality, and we're going to be doing NFTs and special augmented reality things, and we want to know if you have any properties that fit into this. And we said, well, it's funny because we have a character who's based on augmented reality. And we started talking and decided to go ahead. And then the next thing I know, we're involved in a crowdfunder, and I don't know how the heck that happened, but it's an interesting thing. The emotional support we're getting from our fans is incredible. So many people are so excited about the fact that Ron and I are doing a crowdfunder, and I'm thinking, they're saying, why didn't you do this for years? And we're saying, because we're too lazy to. We like to concentrate all our efforts on creating new work, not so much on selling the actual work. So we're kind of incompetent in terms of the crowdfunder stuff.
Well, I think that with it's always a fine line. Are you an artist or are you a salesman? And you're doing something creative, and so you're an artist, whether it's a musician or a writer or someone who draws and paints. But that's really a question that I've always I've struggled with as well. And I spent a great deal of time selling artists. I was an artist rep for a long time, and but when you were at Marvel and you were editor-in-chief, you were doing a lot of selling in a way, because you're coming up with new projects and you're making sure that the powers that be would approve them. Is that correct? Or am I wrong about that?
Yeah. All writers and all artists, you're selling your work. Because you have to, create something that is new and original, that has something that your readers have never seen before. Because if they've seen it before, why are they wasting their time buying it? Now, when you're working on a character like Spider-Man, every month you got to come up with something readers have never experienced before, never thought about before, that sort of thing. But that's why they pay us the mediocre bucks to come out with all of this stuff. That's why, Ron Friends and I, and Ron Friends, Paul Ryan and I, Herb Trimpe, all the artists I worked with, we were always creating a lot of new characters because, hey, that's something you've never seen before. It's a brand new character. and we create new characters, new backstories, all sorts of different things. And that's why Ron and I are excited. We're finally getting our R.I.G.H.T Project out. We on the one hand, it's on Indiegogo, and we just hit our 8,000 level. We have actually other people. Apex Publishing is our publisher, and they're handling the crowdfunder and stuff. And so we got our 8,000 stretch goal, but I'm really excited about our 12,000 stretch goal, because we're going to do something that I don't know if anybody else has ever done before. We're going to do a 16-page digital comic book, which will have the pencils of our lead story plus the plot of our lead story. So anybody who's ever wanted to see what a Marvel style, Marvel method plot looks like can see it, and then can see how the artist translates those words into the plot. Now, Ron and we've been working together for I guess 40 years now. Yikes.
Oh, it's only been like 37.
Oh, only 37?
Yeah,
okay.
It's only 37.
Well, okay, we've got time.
Right.
And so by the time I sit and plot a story, Ron and I have discussed it for hours and hours. Because we got into that habit in Spider-Man. We just discussed the characters and discussed actions, and I'll say, hey, I've got a great idea, and he'll say, oh, I've got a great idea, and it's very annoying because his ideas are always better, and really pisses me off. I was very ungrateful after all the things I've done for him. He always outthinks me. Anyway, Ron Fred's, I think, one of the greatest visual storytellers this medium has ever seen. But when we get to our 12,000 stretch goal, and we only have about 10 days to do it, I hope we make it. Anybody who's ever wanted to see how the pros create comics, here it is. This is something I've wanted to do for so many years, because I'm as I mentioned earlier, I care about the craft, and there is a real craft to creating comics. And I think too many people think writers just sit down and type whatever comes out of their heads, and the artists just sit down and just start drawing and stuff like that. You really have to see how a story is constructed from the ground up, and you need to see how the artist just interprets the writer's words, because an artist is interpreting the words. Like I say, I love the craft. It's a great craft.
So on that subject and artists interpreting the words, let's see, how do I want to ask? So I take it as the writer. Now, actually, I want to back up a little bit, because you've been doing Marvel method, I'm assuming, which is plots before script, correct? Or are you doing scripts?
Well, no, it's I work in all sorts of different formats. When I began at Archie, Archie at that time used storyboards, so I had to sketch out the story, and I can't draw, so I was sketching out the story with basically stick figures, and I put a checkerboard so the editor would know who was Archie. I just used to sketch it out panel by panel. And then at a certain point, I started to work for Charlton and DC, and they liked the what is called the full script method. So a lot of times I'd sketch it out, and then I translate it into a full script method.
Okay.
And when I first started working for Marvel, I'd sketch it out and then translate it into a plot, because that's how I knew how to do it. At a certain point, I learned how to do the Marvel style without doing a lot of sketching out. Full script, I always had to sketch it out, because you only have a certain number of panels to deal with, and I wanted to make sure that everything worked. But
that I didn't know that you were doing that. And
most people don't. I go out and avoid to make things hard for myself.
Well, I think it's really interesting. And especially since you have an artist translating it and you don't see yourself as a visual person, but clearly you are because you're sketching stuff out. Now, the sketches, did those ever go to any of the artists that you worked with?
Well, at Archie, those were the scripts.
Right.
So they used to get them.
Archie.
After Archie, I don't, maybe once or twice, because why bother? The artists, the artists are much more visual than I am. They didn't need to look at my stupid sketches,
Yeah, sometimes it stuff helps too, though.
Yeah, well, sometimes every once in a while I design a cover, so I'd sketch out, the cover.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, no, I guess I think one time I showed Ron what one of my sketches looked like, and he was, almost complimentary.
Okay. So the question I was going to ask is, what kind of surprises have you gotten from artwork that you weren't expecting? And I'm going to ask for, I'll ask for a positive, and we'll just leave it there. But, with somebody like Ron Friends, who you're working with and you're batting ideas back and forth, and I'm assuming that it was the same thing with Paul Ryan, but somebody who you weren't able to do that with. Have you gotten artwork back, or have you seen it in print without seeing it before it came back and were surprised by any of it?
Yes, mainly with full script stuff.
Uh-huh.
I described something and I thought I made it very clear, and then I'd look at the artwork and go, what the heck did he do?
Mm-hmm.
And I always remember, one time it was a sword and sorcery story, and I have the lead character, I don't remember if it was Conan or Red Sonja, basically, leaping across a table to grab two guys by the throat, and then the next panel they were supposed to crack their heads together, and what I got was a close-up of one of Conan or Red Sonja, followed by a bus shot of
Okay.
and I looked and thought, okay, where's the action? And a lot of the action of the story was taken away and replaced by close-ups and bus shots.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh, great. So I'm going to have to do a lot of purple prose describing, all of the stuff that you should have been able to see. Because sometimes with deadlines, you don't have a choice. There have been times where some really terrific artists just misinterpreted something, and you have to go back and ad lib and figure out how to make this work, because we don't have time to get it redrawn.
Mm-hmm.
Most of my career was done during a time where deadlines mattered.
Mm-hmm.
Where when we had newsstand distribution, if a comic book missed its shipping date, it almost wasn't worth publishing it. So we tried never to miss our shipping dates. So yeah, there have been times, but there's also been a lot of things where, I described something and Ron will call me and said, yeah, I'm thinking about the scene that you've got. What if we did this? And like I say, it's always better. Paul Ryan, again, would come up with these things saying, what if we did this instead of that? And I go, hey, I wish I had thought of that. And Herb Trimpe was, Herb would come up with all this crazy stuff that would always amaze me.
Mm-hmm.
I've just been a lucky guy.
So you were editor-in-chief at Marvel during what we tend to call the Image era, when panels and all of that went kind of crazy because it was really art focused. So I'm curious. So now I had talked to Ron about a year ago and talked to him about Thunderstrike #1. And when I talked to him, I mentioned that the artwork looked like it was imaged out, that it was really, it really looked, it was more, it had his wonderful illustration, but it was more designy in a lot of ways. And he talked about the illustrator who he looked at in order to get it like that. And also that because that first issue had, and it was just the first issue that was like that, the first issue had so much more real estate, he was able to open it up and do bigger panels and things of that nature. But so you became editor in '87, I want to say, or editor-in-chief in '87. And that was like right on the cusp. That was, I think that the first, I'm a big Spider-Man fan. And so when I realized you became editor-in-chief, I think the first issue of Spider-Man was one of the Kraven's Last Hunt issues. It was like the fourth part of that. And so that was really right on the cusp of like all the artwork going crazy. So you were you were in charge of interpreting all of that, the new style, as well as making sure stories were told correctly. And you were writing the Fantastic Four, and then later on you were doing Spectacular Spider-Man. And I'm curious, how much did that era, if it did at all, affect the way you wrote?
I don't think it affected the way I wrote so much. I think that era, I remember we were having a lot of discussions with the artists, trying to say, yeah, it's good to experiment. It's good to, do things we've never seen before, but you always have to think story, because, people aren't buying the comic book just to look at the art. They're buying it to have a story experience. So we were constantly explaining to guys, you want to have the, a big visual and that sort of stuff, but you also want to make sure that you're telling the story. So, certain visuals belong on the left side of the page, because sometimes they'd have a, two panel depth thing, and then they'd have like 3 or 4 panels going down. Well, that worked if the big image was on the left side of the page, because on the right side of the page, you knew which order to read the panels. But if it was on the right side of the page, the panels going down, a lot of times you didn't know which order to read the panels in. And artists would say, well, it's very simple if you look like here and here and here. Hey, yeah, you're not going to be there to explain this to people. And we don't want to make this overcomplicated. Reading a comic book should be an instinctive thing. You should instinctively know which panel to go to next. Now, if you want to get basic, most people learn how to read comics or years ago, most people learned how to read comics from newspaper strips. Now they don't have newspapers, forget about the strips. And those were just simple, box. All right, the box thing can get boring, so you want to liven it up. And I think it's important to enliven it, but you also have to understand that this is a visual progression. The artwork tells us what's happening. The words kind of tell us why it's happening. And the artwork and the words have to kind of merge together, to form a symbiosis where the reader doesn't realize he's reading a story, that he gets so deeply involved in it that, that he kind of jumps from panel to panel and his mind is filling in images between the panels that the reader isn't even aware of the fact that his mind is filled in those images. If the reader is looking at the page too long and separating the images, it disrupts the story flow, and he's no longer now part of it. I think the worst thing, the worst kind of criticisms I ever got were when people started talking about my writing or Ron's, depiction of a scene or that sort of thing. Because, Ron and I, we want people to be so deeply involved in the story that all they're thinking about are the characters.
Mm-hmm.
We used to get such a lot of hate mail on Fantastic Four when Paul and I were doing it, because we were so mean to the characters. Oh, so-and-so is suffering. How can you let them suffer so much? And well, we want them to suffer because the more they're suffering, the more you're going to be reading the comic book. If their lives are too happy, you wouldn't want to read their comic book.
Right.
And, Paul and I were happy about that. Ron and I happy when people are concerned about the characters and not so concerned about, how well we're, producing the comic book. These days, a lot of writers have their brands. They're so focused on them and their egos that they're not paying attention to the characters. They're doing their version of Thor instead of doing Thor, their version of Peter Parker instead of doing Peter Parker. And the guys who, focus on the characters are the guys who last on comic books for many, many issues. Jason Aaron is a guy, he's focused on his characters and his characters live and breathe. Dan Slott, he's focused on the characters, whichever book he's doing, and his characters live and breathe. And that's what you want. You want to be focused on the characters, because we're reading these things to step into a fantasy world, but it doesn't do us any good if we're knocked out of the fantasy world. So I feel the same way about movies. Certain movies, you're just deeply involved in the movie, and other movies you're looking and going, the costuming there isn't right. Oh, that car, wrong year. And you're paying attention to that sort of nonsense instead of being, hooked into the story.
So I'm curious about something, and this is actually a little bit away from what we're talking about. About a decade ago. So you guys have been doing Spider-Girl, and you'd been doing Mr. and Mrs. Spider-Man, and you'd been doing all kinds of different Spider-Man stuff. But then somebody had you write a modern, and it's not modern anymore because the character's changed since then, but a modern version of Peter Parker. And I remember reading that you had talked to Dan Slott about what he was doing because you wanted to make sure that the character fit into the new narrative that's going on. And I don't know if you recall that or not. It was a 2-part story. I think it was an Amazing Spider-Man Family or something like that. And my question was going to be, what was it like to go to a character who you were currently writing and had written in the past, but it's a different kind of a version of the character? Did you find that difficult? Was it, or do you even remember any of this?
I remember reading the PR about it, about how they had, kind of retrained me to do the modern version of that sort of stuff. And I thought, what the heck are they talking about?
Okay.
What I did do was I read a bunch of Dan's issues so that I could, mimic his way of handling the dialogue. But that's about all I did, because Peter Parker is still Peter Parker,
right?
At the essence. So, I know that the Marvel publicity people at the time wanted to they, you know, I have the gray hair, so obviously I'm, you know, I'm an old fart, and I am an old fart, but they they wanted to make me more palatable to the current readership. And you know, and I often say, guys, you know, comic books isn't all I do, and my sales are pretty damn good. So, you know, you guys wish your comic book sold as good as my other stuff.
There you go.
So I sometimes think, you know, who am I being palatable to? You know, somebody in the PR department who never heard of me. Well, that's okay. I don't care if you hear me. Read the story. See if the story works for you. If the story works, you don't have to build up a lot of bullshit about it.
Mm-hmm. You know, the first Spider-Man I ever read was one of your issues, and it was the first one that was it was after 252, but it was the first one that you and Ron Friends had done together, and which was the one with the Red Ghost and the Super Apes. And that book made me a fan of the character, and I've continued on with the character since then. But it was really your writing more than anything else, which really brought me in. And there were times in the past where I would start to leave the character, and I would go back and read your issues, and I would be like, well, I can't leave the character because look at who he is. So so you know, I think that if you're writing something, you do leave a stamp on it.
Well, thank you very much.
So you knew Steve Ditko.
Yeah.
And had he ever drawn anything that you wrote? Was it Machine Man?
Yeah, Machine Man.
Okay.
Machine Man, and I think the first issue of Speedball.
Oh, that's right. I don't know why I forgot about that, but yes. So what was it like with him as a storyteller, interpreting the stuff that you were doing?
Oh, because Steve was a dream to work with. He was terrific. I, you know, tend to, you know, get into the detail of you know, and try to describe the story, you know, almost on a panel by panel sequence. And Steve initially said to me, "Hey, you're putting too much stuff into the plot." And I said to him, I said to him, "Steve, how much plot do you want?" He said, "A paragraph would be good." And I thought, yeah, I don't know if I could ever get down to a paragraph. I think the best I ever got down to was maybe a 3-page, you know, three typewritten pages. But with Stevie just needed to know what, you know, what the theme was, what the thrust, what the character thrusts were going to be. And he could throw in a bunch of details. And he was always throwing in extra details, which just took my breath away. You know, and Steve, you know, at the time I was dealing with him, he was, you know, he was always a friendly guy, you know, a friendly, chatty guy. We would talk about all sorts of subjects, you know, politics, philosophy, movies, you know, nonfiction books, fiction books, you know, all sorts of junk. I realized years later I never really discussed comic books with him, but we used to talk about all sorts of other nonsense. And you know, I always thought of Steve as a very friendly guy.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't he, the first conversation you had with him, he called you up and asked you what you knew about comic books?
Something like that.
Okay.
He was working on Machine Man before me. He was working on it with Marv Wolfman. And the editor, Denny O'Neill, said, "How'd you like to write Machine Man?" And I said, "Wow, Steve Ditko's drawing that, right?" He said, "Yeah." And I said, "Is Steve going to continue drawing it?" And then he said to me, "Well, Steve wanted to see the first plot before he decides whether or not he's going to stay." And I thought, you know, on the one hand, I thought that's very fair because he's Steve Ditko and I'm just, you know, I was just Tom Defalco. I mean, what the heck? You know, hey, Steve Ditko's a legend. I'm just a bum. Come on. So I did my first plot and I turned it in, and I'm sitting at home one day and I get a phone call, and and I pick it up, and a voice says to me, "What gives you the right to write about heroes?" And I said, "Who is this?" And he goes, "Steve Ditko. What is a hero to you?" And then he and I started to discuss the philosophies of what makes a hero. What is the essence of a hero? And the conversation lasted like an hour and a half, and got very heated at times. Which Steve always liked to, he liked to have a spirited discussion. And at the end of the discussion, I thought, wow, that was interesting, because hey, I was on the phone with Steve Ditko. But when I got off the phone, I thought, yeah, I didn't know how it went, but I just assumed that whatever test he was giving me, I failed. But I found out later on that no, he actually said, "Hey, I enjoyed this conversation. We have to do it again." And we did do it again, many times over the years. But he stayed on the book, and we ended up having a goofball time with it, a fun time. I looked at the old Machine Man thing, and we knew that the book had one foot in the grave and the other on a banana peel. So I, at one point, made this conscious decision to overwrite the hell out of the book, make it more of a parody of a Stan Lee kind of thing than an actual thing, because my normal writing style is very sparse. And I look back on that and think, boy, was that a stupid decision. I should have just written it like I like to write and forget about, trying to con people.
So how early in your Marvel career was that?
That was, kind of the beginning of my Marvel career. I think I'd done a few things here and there. I had done a tryout story with the Vision, which years later they were using that plot as for new artists to draw.
Okay.
Whole generation of artists grew up hating me because of that plot. I forget what came next. At one point, they asked me to do a what if comic book about the Kree-Skrull Wars, and they asked me to script an issue of the 2-in-1, and I was just kind of showing up when anybody needed things, and at the time I was also doing some work for DC and Archie and Charlton. I was I'm a gadfly. I go all over the place.
So you started out as a writer at Marvel and not an editor?
Yeah, I started out as a freelance writer. And then at one point I became a contract writer. And then Jim Shooter was reorganizing the editorial department. He had known that I had edited at Archie. And he said to me, why don't you come on staff and, work as an editor? And at the time I said, Jim, I haven't had a full-time job in, I don't know, many years, because even at Archie, I was only going in there 2 or 3 days a week. And the rest of the time, pounding the old typewriter. And Jim said to me, well, can you do it for maybe 6 months just till I get the staff the way I want it? Just 6 months. And I thought, yeah, I can do it for 6 months. I can do anything for 6 months. And so I took what I thought was going to be a temporary job. 6 months turned into closer to 20 years. My goal there when I joined was just to edit comic books for 6 months and then go back to full-time writing. I somehow or other, I became Jim Shooter's second in command, and then eventually replaced Jim. And I remember the day that they told me that they, I don't want to get into the politics of it all, they were going to, let Jim go and put me in charge. And I said to the president of company at the time, I said, you know, I think you're making a mistake. You know, for one thing, I'm a freelancer masquerading as a staff person. So you have to understand that, you know, my first loyalty is always going to be to the freelancers. And the president of company looked at me and said, well, that's your job. That's where your loyalty is supposed to be. He said, we expect you to make money for us, but you have to take care of your people. And I thought, okay, well, hey, this is a refreshing way of going about things.
So when you went back to being a freelancer, what was the transition like for you? Because you were going into an office every day, and then all of a sudden you're working from home, and you know, and that's almost like a culture shock. Was that easy for you? Was it like, oh, this is familiar, or was it like, I got to go someplace else and work?
No, it was an easy transition because in those days when I was on staff, I was getting up every morning about 5 o'clock, doing some writing, catching a 7:30 train into the office, hanging around for the day, hoping to catch the 7 o'clock train back home, then do some writing, and then catch 4 or 5 hours of sleep, and then do it the next morning. The only thing different was on the weekends, where I didn't have to go into the office, but I still had to put in those kind of hours. Mm-hmm. When I switched to freelance, it was, hey, I get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I'll be honest, I only did that for a couple of months, and then said, you know what, I can get up at 5:30 now.
There you go.
And I'd get up at 5:30, and I'd work till about 2 or 3 o'clock. Mm-hmm. Have lunch, take a little nap, and then most times go back to work till about 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And think, wow, hey, I get to sleep for 6 or 7 hours a night. This is great. So it was a wonderful thing for me.
So what's your like? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
What? It was just a crazy schedule.
Okay, so are you still getting up at 5:30?
No. Now I get up anywhere from 7 to 8 o'clock, and I'm not putting in as many hours these days. But a bunch of years ago, I used to, on Sundays, would have lunch around 1 o'clock, so that I could watch the first half of the Jet game. And if you know anything about football and the New York Jets, usually that's more than enough time to know that they had no chance of winning. And a bunch of years ago, I thought, you know what, I can watch a whole game now. And then I started taking more time off, and I discovered this incredible thing called weekends off. Really, it's a fascinating thing. It took me into my 60s before I discovered what that was. And now I'm getting more and more time, which is why Rod Friends and I can finally bring out the R.I.G.H.T Project, because now I have a lot more spare time. Ron is still working, the 8 to 10 hour days, but me not as much anymore.
So when you're working, okay, so you're tasked with the job of creating something basically from scratch. And I know that, for example, when you were doing Amazing Spider-Man, you bought like magic cards or something, and that's where the villains came from that you saw in a commercial. I want to hear that, but where do a lot of these ideas come from?
Well, the short answer is I have no idea.
Okay.
I don't know where the ideas come from. I will tell you that I bought a bunch of, they were animal cards. They were all about animals, describing what, you know, the traits of different animals and pictures and that sort of thing. And I used that as the basis for a number of Spider-Man villains, the Black Fox, Silver Sable, Puma. You know, I'm not sure where an idea comes from. You know, sometimes you see the climax of a story in your head. Sometimes you see the beginning of a story in your head, and then you start to write the story, and then you realize you started at the wrong place. You got to throw out the first 10, 15 pages. You know, to me, it's all about characters and character interplay, and what does this say about the human condition? Spider-Man was always very easy because I used to look at every Spider-Man story and say, the theme of Spider-Man is responsibility. So this story has to be about responsibility in some way, shape, or form. It's got to say something about responsibility, about different types of responsibility that clash against each other. You know, Peter has a responsibility to Aunt May, and a responsibility to Mary Jane, and a responsibility to the innocents of the city. And he's put in a story where he's got constantly making decisions between which responsibility is he going to jump to here and now. Our characters all have to make decisions. If a character doesn't make, you know, a bunch of decisions in the course of the story, he's not a character, he's a prop. And, you know, because people are constantly making decisions. When I was editor-in-chief, I used to tell all my editors, all you are is a decision-making machine. You're making decisions one after the other, and you're making them, a lot of them so fast, you don't even realize you're making decisions. And, you know, and stories follow, you know, construction. You construct stories the way you construct a house. You lay a foundation of you know, what is this character's status quo? And then what upsets that status quo? And how is the character different at the end of the story than he was at the beginning of the story? You know, I'll express something that happened badly. The second Batman movie. You know, it starts out, Batman is wanted by the police. Well, police are wishy-washy about catching him, but Batman is wanted by the police. He ends up fighting the Joker. He ends up fighting Two-Face. He can't let people know that Two-Face was the district attorney. So at the end, Batman is wanted by the police. Well, now they might be a little bit more interested in getting him, but you know, we end up the way we started. You know, I'm sorry. You know, if I was going to do that story, he wouldn't be wanted by the police in the beginning and would be at the end, or vice versa. You know, some sort of change. And
okay, so
you know, and it was a good Batman movie otherwise.
Okay, so now I have a question that I wasn't planning on, because you mentioned that there is an idea right now floating within the comic book companies that at the end of a writer's run, they have to go back to the factory reset and basically leave the character where they left them. In other words, it's like you're taking the characters out of the toy box and you're playing with the characters. And then at the end of your run, you're just putting them back where they were. When you guys were working on it, I mean, not specifically you, but I know that when you took over from Roger Stern, that wasn't the case. And you left in the middle of a story, but that was something different. You didn't get to finish up your run. But what do you think of that idea? If you're telling a story for 60 or 120 issues, would you want to put the character back where he was?
Well, you know, the idea of putting things back in the toy box, that was something that, you know, I've heard that since the beginning of my career.
Okay.
That, you know, you shake things up and at the end you put everything back. And that's a big exaggeration. I mean, you don't leave the character in chaos, unless you're, ripped off in the middle of a storyline. But you restabilize the character at the end. And if you've done your job, the character really is different, and it's a different person in a different headspace, and there are all sorts of differences at the end than there are in the beginning. There may be some surface stuff that's there. Comic book fans are a cowardly and superstitious lot. They always want to see things the way they were when they were a kid, when they were reading comic books. That's why DC has to keep resetting its universe, because the creators come in and they look and they say, they've made all sorts of changes to my favorite character. The Flash is no longer the Flash I grew up with. It's a different Flash. So I have to, get everything jumbled up so I can get back to my Flash. And that's why they're constantly, rebooting their universe. I'm more aware of DC constantly rebooting the universe than I am of Marvel. I don't know if Marvel has rebooted its universe. I've heard a couple of times that maybe they have, maybe they haven't. I fully confess that I am not up to date on current comic for a whole bunch of reasons. Because hey, I like the comic books that I grew up with as a kid. If I'm gonna, read some goofball comics, I want to read some Stanley and Jack Kirby, Stanley and Steve Ditko, some Bob Powell stuff, some Will Eisner stuff, all the stuff that I loved as a kid. I still love that stuff, and would like to continue to read that sort of thing. I've had discussions with different people, and they said, what kind of comic books would you like to do? And and I've often said, well, there's the philosophical comic books that I'd like to do, and there's the actual comics I'd like to do. Philosophically, I like things I grew up with. Kongorilla. I had a magic ring, put his head into the gorilla's body. Hey, and that would be for 5 pages. And that's about all it was good for. Adam Strange. Every time he was about to kiss his girlfriend, he gets that back to earth. Those are the philosophical comic books. They would be unsaleable today. There's, Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos. That I think you could actually get away with if you really amped up the action and the humor. But a lot of things that I like philosophically, I wouldn't bother to do it practically. Again, jumping to the R.I.G.H.T Project. These, I think one of the problems of today's comic books is things take too long for anything to happen. Stories are stretched out beyond where they should be. So with the R.I.G.H.T Project, Ron and I decided we're going to do in a 32-page comic book, we're going to do 2 11-page stories with beginning, middle, and each story is going to be packed with shit. Packed with stuff, exciting hoo-ha action, and characterization. And we've been told that we stick more in 11 pages than a lot of guys stick in 44 pages. So you're going to get, 2 stories actually in the first thing. Now that we crossed our $8,000 stretch goal, you're going to get 3 stories in that, 2 11 pages and 1 5-pager. Every once in a while at Marvel, they call me up and they said, we need a 5-page story. And then they give me some bullets to why they're calling me up. And I always say to the editor, the reason you're calling me up for the 5-page story is because I'm the only one who can actually tell a whole story in 5 pages. And the editor goes, yeah, you're right. I said, yeah, as long as I have that skill, somebody will call me up every once in a while.
It's, it's really interesting when I started doing professional comics. I was working for AC Comics, the people who do FemForce.
Hmm.
And Len Straczewski is a friend of mine. He used to do JSA. He did a bunch of stuff at DC in the 90s. And he came on board to write a couple stories, and he did a couple 10-page stories. And as I'm working on my own project now, these stories keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And part of it is how much I'm able to sell and what my profit margin is. So I'm stretching them out to a certain amount as far as printing is concerned. But one of the things that I've realized lately is I'll look at the stories that he did and I thought, God, how can I do them in 10 pages? And I don't have an answer. I think that sometimes a constraint, if you're trying to build a gigantic story, is a little bit tougher. But people like you who are able to do that is you guys are like my heroes, because it's like, how do you do that? And I just have no clue.
Well, you just throw out all the stuff that doesn't fit your theme. Because every story has some hot air. Just squeeze out all the hot air. And you want to tell a big story. I understand that, because we all want to tell big stories. But you can tell a giant story at 11 pages a shot. We used to do this in Spider-Girl. I did it with Pat Olaf. I did it with Ron Friends. Every issue was a single issue story. All right. But if you read 6 issues in a row, you got a bigger story. We used to do that on a regular basis, but we knew we had 6 issues. Spider-Girl was a comic book that ran for 13 years, but most of the time, hey, can you do 5 or 6 more issues? We had no idea if we'd ever do a 7th. I look back on that and think crazy times. But you can tell a massive epic 5 pages at a time.
Okay.
Because every story builds on the previous one. And if you control your craft better, you can do that without referring to any of the previous ones. Every story, you should tell a reader everything they need to know: who the characters are, what the characters want, what the character needs, what's preventing the character from getting what he needs, what's his relationship with all the characters. That's the basis of Archie Comics. They're mainly 5-page stories. And yet anybody can pick up any Archie comic book at random and know who the characters are. And that used to be the thing with any comic book. Nowadays, you pick up a comic book, you have no idea where the heck you are.
So around the time you guys started Spider-Girl, and you had left the Spider-Man stories, and there was this little era in between. One of the things that Marvel was doing was they were doing like these fold out. Actually, I think they did it while you were still working on the book. They had these fold out covers where they're like, "This is what happened in the last issue." I don't know if you recall that or not. What did you?
I do. What?
What did you think of that? Do you think that was a good way to bring people up to speed, or no?
I thought that a lot of the guys had lost the craft, and they needed something, like they needed that crutch. My editors were always saying, we're putting this in. You don't have to. You don't have to reintroduce the characters every month. And one editor said, basically, I grabbed 2 or 3 of your captions, and that's what I'm using to do it. You use whatever crutch you need. I didn't see the need for it for my books, and but I think a lot of guys need that. I've read every once in a while. I pick up something looks interesting. So I pick up a comic book and I read it. And then I realize, I just read the whole comic book, and never once did they mention the character's name. And never once did they mention any of the other characters' names. So if this was my first book, I wouldn't know, I think I'd know who the book was about, because, theoretically there'd be a big figure of that character on the cover.
And his name probably.
And the name on the cover, but since nobody called him that, I'm could that be a good guy or that be a bad guy? There was an editor at DC that his books always ended up with a full page splash of a villain. I knew it was the villain on the last page of a story. And most times that villain was never named. Most times I got there, and I'm not as familiar with the DC stuff, so I didn't know who the heck the guy was. I just know that people would look and go, "Oh no, it's him." And I'd think, man, all these guys are named Tim. Marvel should sue because we had the first Tim.
That's right. How are you on time?
I have no idea what time it is.
Oh, yeah. No, it's a little after 4 your time. I just wanted to make sure that you didn't have. Real quick, I want to. I have one more question, and then we can wrap it up. So, you had mentioned that you enjoy reading the Stan Lee and Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby and the Will Eisner and everything. I understand that a number of years ago you got rid of your collection right around the time of one of the hurricanes, and I can't remember which one it was. And it was, the stuff was in your garage and stuff. See, I told you I was going to tell you a story that sounds like I'm stalking you, but I'm not. But you still have your Amazing Fantasy 15. So I'm curious if you're willing to share what else is still in that collection.
Oh, well, a lot of my collection was wiped out. And Hurricane Sandy, my house was flooded. What can I tell you? I needed money to rebuild. So I had to sell a bunch of other things. But I have the Marvel Masterworks. So that's where I reread a lot of the stuff. My Amazing Fantasy 15 would have to be restored significantly to get up to poor condition. The cover is ripped. As a kid, I had to put staples in to hold the pages together, because I read that comic book ragged, and it's still a ragged thing. I didn't bother to try to sell that because, I would have had to pay the dealer to take it away. But I still have a bunch of Jack Kirby's comic books, which happened to be up in my office at the time. Some Bob Powell comic books, and what I got? I got Brave and the Bold 1 to 24.
Oh wow!
The Joe Kubert, Viking Prince stuff. I think of the fact that I lost most of my collection, but I still have some nice pieces and stuff like that. I've got some guy keeps coming, calling me up and saying, "Hey, I want to buy your comic books and your original art." He said, "I assume you have a great collection of original art," and I do have a bunch of original arts. A lot of it is comic strips, because hey, I found out you could buy Leonard Starr stuff and Walt Kelly Pogo stuff on eBay. So yeah, I went out and bought a bunch of that stuff. Somebody was saying, "Yeah, do you have any Jack Kirby, original artwork?" I'm thinking, Jack Kirby. As luck has it, I actually have two pieces. But this guy was looking for stuff from the 60s, and I'm thinking, the 60s? I was in high school at the time. How am I going to have that stuff? I have two pieces of Jack Kirby original artwork, because one time I was at a New York comic book convention. This is, I'm going to say, probably in the 70s. And Jack was working on he'd come back and was writing and drawing Captain America at the time. And he's sitting at the table. He's got some original artwork for sale. And I was just amazed. Jack Kirby is actually sitting in front of me. So I got a chance to talk to him. And he was selling the things. I think he was selling at $35 a piece. And I think I had $72 in my pocket. Just enough to buy two pieces and a Subway token home, because nobody had credit cards in those days. Right. And I got the two pieces, and I said, could you sign one? So he signed one, but I was embarrassed to ask him to sign the other one too. So I have two pieces of Jack Kirby original artwork, not from the 60s or any of the Prime stuff. Although, Jack Kirby at his worst was still Jack Kirby. I've got some Steve Ditko stuff from our Machine Man days. But the comic book original artwork I have it's all from stuff. Most of it is from stuff I worked on.
So real quick, you saw him at a convention in the 70s, you said?
Yeah.
So, all right. So I told the story that I had met you in the 80s at a convention. And I gotta tell you, the way you felt about meeting Jack Kirby was the way I felt about meeting you and Ron Friends. And I'm not joking about that. So what was it like for you? Because how old were you when you walked into the convention?
Well, I know I was working for Archie Comics at the time.
Okay, so you were already working in the business.
I was already working in the business. Okay. So I guess it was, it would be, mid to late 70s. I'm not exactly sure. And like I say, he was working on, this was the period of time where he was writing and drawing Captain America and the Eternals and that sort of stuff. I was pretty tongue tied when I saw him, because he was, he's Jack Kirby. But it's one of my heroes. Jack Kirby was a hero. Steve Ditko was Stan Lee. I was a lucky guy because I got to work with Stan a lot for a lot of years, and Stan was the ultimate idea machine. Stan would just sit there and rattle off idea after idea after idea. He and I would be walking down a hall. He'd look at covers, comic book covers, and he just offhanded comments that I would think, gee, I wish I had a notepad to write all this stuff down, because it was like going to college without having to pay tuition. And he so many times he'd rattle off. I'd say to him, yeah, I got to come up with some story ideas, and he'd say, well, why don't you do this, this, and this? And off the top of his head, boom, 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 5 ideas. And maybe, 2 of them I've seen before, and one of them I say, but at least one of them I'd go, that's a pretty good idea. And I'd say to him, Stan, could I steal that from you? And he'd go, what? Because by then he'd already forgotten it. He was on the next idea. I was not there at the beginning of the Marvel universe. I don't know who created what. I just know that you had 2 idea factories. Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, both of these guys coming up with ideas like crazy. Nobody wrote anything down because they didn't expect it to last.
Mm-hmm.
They came out with the Fantastic Four, and superheroes. They were hoping, and I've heard this from Stan so many times, he was hoping to get 2, maybe 3 years out of superheroes. Mm-hmm. And he thought that by then he'd be out of comic books. And that was his goal. And that's why, nobody knows who created what, because nobody cared then. It wasn't important enough to them. Years later, once these things are all worth things, everybody wants to get credit. I see people, getting credit for all sorts of things that, or claiming credit for things. I know guys are claiming, I created that character. I'm thinking, yeah, I think you were the inker on that book. First time you saw the character, it had already been written and drawn. So who are you fooling? But everybody, and I'm happy to, say, hey,
Well, you had one comment, one more question, then I'll let you go if you've got the time.
Okay.
All right. So the first comment is you've gotten to see your own name at the end credits of some of these movies that are out. How does that feel? That's not the question, but but I am curious.
It's cool. It's nice. The first time I heard about it, Marvel calls me up and says, "Yeah, hey, we got good news. You're gonna, they're using one of your characters in the movie, and we're gonna send you a check." And I said, "Really? How much is it?" And then I called Ron and I said, "Hey, they're using a character we created. They're gonna send us a check." And Ron says, "Are we gonna get credit at the end of the movie?" And I said, I didn't ask that. He said, "What'd you ask?" I said, "I asked how much the check was." And I don't get as excited when I see my name in credits or that sort of stuff. I don't really, to me, it's all about the work. Hey, they're using a character of ours. Hey, that's cool. And they're sending us a check. The check is always, you're a creative person. You always have to get paid.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't get paid, you're going to have to go out and get a real job. So we have to get paid because that allows us to continue, creating things. I'm a lucky guy. I've gotten to the point where I don't have to worry about getting paid anymore. Mm-hmm. But you make sure you get paid.
Mm-hmm.
Get paid.
Well, the freelancer, the freelancers always have one word, and that word is how much we getting for this. All one word. That's what I found once I started repping illustrators was how much we getting for this. All one word. And that was always the first word that anyone said whenever a project came in. How much we getting for this?
Listen, we were all in that situation. For many years, I used to say there are 3 reasons to do a job. The money, and the money is so good you can't refuse it. The challenge, you look at it and go, "Yeah, I never did anything like that. How the heck do you do that? I should take it just to see, or the love." I remember one time somebody had gotten the rights to R.I.G.H.T, and I got in touch with a publisher and I said, "Hey, that's a great property. Good luck. I wish you the best of luck with it." And the guy said to me, "Oh, thank you. Would you be interested in writing a 5-page R.I.G.H.T story?" And I said, "Yeah, hey, yes, I love R.I.G.H.T. And then later on, I called Ron and I said, "Hey, I'm going to do a R.I.G.H.T story." And he said, "Are they going to pay you?" Oh, yeah, I forgot to ask. But I'm doing a Richie Rich story. I felt the same way when I first, something it asked me to help out on some Phantom stuff. Hey, they asked me to do some Phantom stuff. It's cool. You're gonna get paid. Yeah, that's King Features. I'm sure they're gonna pay me. But you do certain things you do for love.
Mhm.
I shouldn't say this out loud because Archie will take advantage of it. Anytime Archie calls me up, I have to do the story for them. I have to, because I still love those characters. I still love, I started at Archie. I love Archie. Most of the time when Marvel calls me, I have to do it because I still love the company and that sort of thing. Every once in a while, they ask me to do something that I can say no to, but even that's kind of hard.
Mhm.
I've gotten to the stage in my life where it's either love or the challenge. It's got to be something that I'm looking at and think, how the heck do you do this? The right project fits into that because I love the character. I love the chance to work with Ron and Sal. And I had no idea what the heck a crowdfunder was.
Uh-huh.
I've supported a bunch, but I didn't know from the inside. Now I know. It's probably going to be my best crowdfunder.
Do you find it exciting?
I find it interesting. I think it's a heck of a lot more work than anybody tells you it's going to.
Mm-hmm.
This one's important because this is probably the last time that Ron, Sal, and I will get a chance to work together. The band is, I think, finally, one of us feels he should retire at this stage. Ironically, it's the one that's in the best of health. Does have a few years on us. I don't want to point any fingers at Sal, who's ruining the whole band.
Well, tell Ron he needs to stop acting like this and get back to work.
Now, Ron is going to have that pencil in his hand. The day he dies, that pencil is going to be there. But what can I tell you? We're all getting old.
The first thing when I started my book, I did my first issue, and then the second issue was a crowdfunder. And I didn't have a built-in audience, so it was basically me going on Facebook every 2 hours and having people put money in. And yeah, it's a toughie. It really is, because then you're like, am I sending out too many emails? Is this too tough? Why should they give me money? But everybody loves your stuff, not me, you. So you've got a little bit of a built-in audience there, which we're all too happy to support you. And I feel bad because I wasn't the first person. I think I was like number 4. But
that's an outrage.
I know it.
Listen, thank you very much. I am terrible with social media, Facebook, that sort of stuff. I always felt every time I turned on the computer, I should be working. So I never had time for any of the social media things. I got browbeaten into doing Facebook. Denny Fingeroth browbeat me into doing it. Said, you have to have Facebook. You have to, at the very least. You should, mention every time you have a new book out or something like that. You should mention on Facebook. And most of the time, I forget. Whenever you're going to a convention, and I just realized I'm going to 2 conventions. I got to go on Facebook and mention the conventions. I'm just terrible with that stuff because. If I'm going to spend 4 or 5 hours in front of the computer, I should be telling some story or part of a story or something like that. That's what I should be doing. I'm an old storyteller, but I'm still a storyteller, and I love the comic craft, and I just love the medium so much, and still do. some of the other media that I've had to work in over the years, I realized I didn't love it as much. It paid better, but I didn't have the love for it that I have for comics. I know I'm a sap enough that if somebody called me up and asked me to work on a comic strip today, which, you're working for practically nothing. I know I'm a sap enough that I'd probably snap it up if it was the right character. And and you think at my advanced years I would get smarter, but I'm still the same old doofus that I always was.
Well, if you're not getting jazzed when you're working on something, then what's the point?
Yeah, you got to give it your all. I know I once said to Mark DeMattis, I'm a one-note writer. He says, "What do you mean by a one-note writer?" I said, I have to, I have to get passionately involved, and I have to give it 100%. And I always have to work at 100%, because if I don't care 100%, I don't think the readers will care. And DeMattis said, "Well, I don't think that's the definition of a one-note writer." No, there's a great writer.
There you go.
I can look at Mark DeMattis and say, he's a great writer. I'm a decent storyteller, but he's a great writer.
You know what? I think everybody is. I think everybody's great. And it's, I almost hesitate to bring this up, but I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but they have put Ben Reilly back in the role of Spider-Man in the books right now.
Yeah, DeMattis is writing a limited series.
And he's writing a limited series, right? But it was really funny because I had a subscription to Amazing Spider-Man, from the Marvel subscription department, which is really bad right now, by the way. But that's neither here nor there. And I'm looking at these covers, and I'm like, God, that reminds me of 1994. I don't want to wait for these books to show up. I have to go get them, because it's nostalgia in a lot of ways for the work that you guys did on that character. And those stories that you guys told, I know that there's always, you get some people who hate them, some people who like them. But the thing that I really loved, there are two things I loved about those stories. The first one was you never knew what the next issue was going to bring. And it was completely unpredictable. And was Peter Parker going to survive that storyline? And the answer wasn't there. I really like that as somebody who had been reading the books for 10 years. And the other thing that I really like was, the Ben Reilly character himself. Everyone said, well, he was more like a darker Spider-Man, or he was this, or he was that. But he was an outsider who was finding a life for himself. And he had that going for him more than the X-Men did, to where anybody, when you're a teenager, chances are you're not super happy with your life. Some people are, but some people aren't. And a lot of people feel like outsiders for this reason or that reason. And what that character said to every single reader who was paying attention was, I'm somebody who was born in a lab. I shouldn't even be here, but I found this life for myself, and I found a way to be happy. And that aspect of the character is something that no other character that I know of is like that. Because, he was called genetic trash. He was called all of this stuff. I mean, in your own stories,
yeah.
But here was somebody who found a reason to be alive and to be happy, and whether he was in love with Janine or he became Spider-Man. And the fun thing about that was, and now I'm babbling too much, but the fun thing about that was when Peter found out he was a clone, there were like those 5 issues where he kind of went down a deep spiral, but then he bounced back, and all of a sudden it didn't matter, because he was still Peter Parker, and he still had this and he still had that. And that's very inspirational for somebody. For anybody, if you're paying attention. If you're not like, it's not my Spider-Man, blah, 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 well, then forget it. You're not gonna understand it. But if you're somebody who feels like you're standing just even a little bit outside, the norms of society, it's right there, and it tells you that's okay.
Yeah,
it's still worthwhile. And that's that was the secret to that character, I thought.
I think you kind of nailed a lot of it. It's funny about the whole Capone saga, because anytime people interview me, they always say, "Oh, this was a controversial story." I'm sure you don't want to discuss it because it was so controversial at the time. People hated it. And I always go, "Hey guys, here it is. Close to 30 years later, and people are still talking about it. We must have done something right." The stories that people talk about years later, those are the ones that stuck with them.
Mm-hmm.
And as a writer, as a reader, there were certain scenes that I read that are still with me, even though I read them when I was 10 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And as a writer, I wanted to see if I could craft other scenes that would stick with my readers years later. And, and I started to go to conventions a couple of years ago. And I've run into so many wonderful readers that, say to me, at one point I was really down and I blah, 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 blah. And I read this Thor comic book and this scene inspired me, or this scene here inspired me. It's always different scenes. And, it's a wonderful, that to me is a wonderful thing. And that I get a bigger high out of that than seeing my name on a movie. I can see my name or my pen name on movies. Big deal. But knowing that some of the scenes I've written have touched people, that's priceless.
I keep saying one more question, but I have one more because as the conversation has gone on, some of it's become interesting. I mean, it's all interesting, but some of it's like it's spawning this question or that question. So one more question, and I'm gonna let you go.
Okay.
So, you're talking about these scenes that you're writing and these scenes that you find, that you hope people remember. Have you ever found yourself in a position where you're writing something which you feel is important, but it's emotionally uncomfortable to the point where it's like, well, I don't really want to talk about this because it bugs me, but even though the story is important? Does that make sense? Is that a question that makes sense?
Yeah, there have been times, in my writing career where I'm dealing with things that, emotionally are ripping me apart as I'm writing it. Because again, it has to affect me. If it's not affecting me, it's not going to affect the reader.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times there's certain scenes, there have been times when I'm having trouble typing because the tears are running down my face. But the final issue of Thunderstrike.
Mm-hmm.
There's a scene where Kevin goes back to his father's grave. That still gets to me. And I know it still gets to Ron too. The two of us, we every time we read that comic book, he'll call me up and say, I just read Thunderstrike. I bawled my eyes out yet again. And yeah. And then there are sometimes you're dealing with topics that are very uncomfortable topics, but they need to be discussed.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime I've done a story about human trafficking,
mm-hmm.
That is a horrible, disgusting, reprehensible thing, that the fact that human beings will traffic other human beings. I'm about to rant and rave, but you can see how I feel about the subject. makes me uncomfortable, but yes, I've written stories about it because I think we have to deal with these things. So, yeah, the short answer to your question is yeah.
It's really funny that you brought that up, because that was what I was specifically thinking of, because I wrote a story about human trafficking as well. And it's one of those things where, you know, the people who are buying my book are buying it because they like the ghost stories and they like the adventure and blah, blah, blah. And then here's this thing about human trafficking and it's really gross. And, you know, and I put a disclaimer at the end, so people didn't think I thought this was a great thing. And I can't promote it because I don't like talking about it. Because it is a tough subject. It's a very, very hard subject. And it's just something that historically was just accepted in a lot of ways.
Listen, in Spider-Girl at one point, Mayday would get bruised.
Mm-hmm. I remember the story.
And we had a scene where some girl looks at Mayday and says, who did it, your boyfriend or your
right.
And that led Ron and I down a rabbit hole where we started to do all this research on essentially boyfriend abuse and stuff. And I was sick reading this stuff, but we felt we had to do it in a code approved comic book and get that information out there, because it's important that young girls know that they're not alone and they don't have to be alone with this sort of terrible situation. And this is something that I have to say, maybe I'm stupid, but I was totally oblivious to this most of my life. And there are some sickos out there. And sometimes we have to, shine a flashlight on the shadows.
Sure. So let's end on a happy note.
Okay.
So talk real quickly. Do a plug for your crowdfunder.
Well,
and whatever you want to say about that, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay. Well, the crowdfunder is called it's on Indiegogo. It's called Tom Defalco and Ron Friends, the R.I.G.H.T Project. It's a lot of hoo-ha action. If you want grim, gritty, depressing comic books, this is not for you. If you're a fan of multi-part epics and never-ending company crossovers, this is not for you. This has 3 complete stories in it, 2 11 pages, one 5-pager. We've got a lot of characterization. You will love our characters. You will love Mr. Right. There are those who say we poke a little fun at the superhero medium. Maybe, but Ron and I were never that serious about superheroes to begin with. I'm convinced everybody who buys this thing will end up with a nice big smile on their face. It will take you. It will take you to a nostalgia you never knew you missed, or maybe even experienced. The best part is, if we get to our 12,000 crowdfunder, you'll see what one of my plots look like and what Ron's pencils look like and how we put a comic book together, and it will help teach you the craft of comics, which is what I'm mainly interested in. Every once in a while, when I go to conventions, I'm asked to give talks on how to write comics, and I give everybody a copy of a plot, a copy of a full script. And people are fascinated by that because now they think they have the keys to the kingdom. Hopefully they listen to the rest of the lecture. They know how to actually construct the story. But these are all important things. So come help us get to 12,000 things so I can give you this free comic book. I want to give you a free comic book. Come on, It's digital, but it's still free. So that's it. Hoo-ha. Thanks for being there.
Real quick, how much is the stretch goal to where we get to see your storyboards?
Well, we're at 8,000 now, so I guess it's about 4 more thousand.
Okay. No, your storyboards, the ones that you've drawn.
My storyboards.
Yes, your storyboards for this. How much is
I didn't do storyboards for Mr. Wright. I'm sorry, I didn't do just the regular plot.
Okay.
With Ron, I never bothered to do story. Once Ron and I were working together, maybe if I'm working on a plot, and I just want to make sure a scene will fit, I might, do some doodles, but I never really did storyboards with Ron Fritz. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming. And if you want to hold on for a second, after I close this down, and thank you all for watching. Happy Halloween, which is this week. If the information for Tom and Ron's project is in the link below, you'll find that, as well as the email that you would have to contact me in order to get a free digital copy of the first issue of Visitations. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.